Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Melissa Pineda, and today I will be discussing Robert Sapolsky's book, Stress and Your Body. So this book is actually a compilation of 24 of his lectures, and it is very comprehensive. Like at the end of this book, I felt as though I had attended a full year of university course on this same subject, and it was excellent. It was a super interesting read, and he's funny too. Like I did the audiobook of this, and he's got like a lot of humor, and yeah, it was very interesting. So whether you read it or listen to it, I think it's worthwhile. I'm going to tell you why. So really quickly though, I will tell you a little bit about Mr. Sapolsky. Um, First little side note, it's Sapolsky, S-A. But Audible here has put his name, well, spelled it incorrectly, S-I. So I did a double check online, and yeah, it's definitely S-A, Polsky. So he is an American neuroendocrinology researcher and author. That's why I had to write it down. Uh, he's a professor of biology, neurology, neurological sciences, and neurosurgery at Stanford University. Yeah, just let that sink in for a minute. I had to. He has also studied stress vulnerability in baboons in East Africa since the 70s. He goes every summer apparently and does that. So he is quite an interesting guy. So let me now tell you about this lecture series. So this whole book is about, you guessed it, stress and the effects on the body. And he gives a very comprehensive study analysis on stress and what it does to your body. And he talks about different phases like the start, the very first humans, and how stress responses were activated in their bodies. So he talks about how, they had to run away from like saber-toothed tigers, and how our bodies are still built the same, like gene-wise, DNA, all the stress responses are the same, except they're not being utilized for the same reasons anymore, since most of us aren't running away from saber-toothed tigers. And he talks about how like it's affecting our bodies significantly because like we actually can bring those responses, like activate them mentally now. So we'll be thinking about something when we're lying in bed at night, thinking about something stressful or a conversation that we had, and those same responses are being activated as though we were running away from a saber-toothed tiger. So, I mean, that takes a toll on your body. He talks about that. He talks about stress at different levels in your life too, and how a lot of people will say things like, I'm stressed 24/7. Like I'm always stressed. And even myself, I've thought before, like I deal with stress, on a daily basis. I mean, as do we all, but it feels a little heavier at times, right? And he's saying there's no like 24/7 stress unless you have a body burn, unless something serious has happened to you, then you have constant, unrelenting stress. But people are very liberal using terms like, I'm constantly under stress. This book is definitely for people of all ages. He talks about stress at different stages of life, as well, and how stress plays a role in different diseases, and how some diseases are exacerbated by stress but are not caused by stress. So he says when you're young, stress management is about trying to make the stressor go away. Whereas effective stress management when you're older, you have to learn to adapt to the inevitable. A lot of it has to do with acceptance. Sometimes successful stress management is about cognitive flexibility, and how he describes that is try something different for the problem that isn't getting solved. If you keep trying your same response to a stressor and it's not helping, try something different. Or it might also mean, the cognitive flexibility might also mean start accepting something that won't go away, trying to deal with it in terms of, acceptance. A sense of self-control is great in many situations, but sometimes that's also not helpful because it's not possible. Predictive info he talks about. So getting information, predictive information is great sometimes, but only in certain situations, like situations where it will tangibly help you somehow. You don't, for instance, he gives an example on like somebody that knows that, they're going to lose a leg in 5 years, not necessarily helpful predictive information or information that won't get you depressed. Sometimes the predictive information isn't helpful in terms of your mental state. Sapolsky talks about how sometimes it just comes down to accepting. So everyone is very well acquainted or familiar with the Serenity Prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr. He wrote it in or published it in 1951. So God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Sometimes that is what we need. And he says other times that is not helpful. He goes through just some scientific history, lots of studies, and how there's a period of time decades ago where there was this push toward having people think more on positively, change your mindset kind of thing. And yes, this is effective in many situations. Other times it's just used to kind of guilt the person, you have cancer, but this could have been avoided holistically if you had had a more positive mindset. Or if you were born into a different family, then, you wouldn't have had these stressors and this wouldn't have led to the disease you now have. So he's like, that's not helpful. But other times the Serenity Prayer is exactly what some people need. Sapolsky also talks about the lasting impact of neglect and what stress can do to someone's body as a result of the lack of human contact and stimulation. So Sapolsky talks about specifically cases involving children, unfortunately, where their growth has been completely stunted as a result of this. And there was one child who was taken away from a very, very abusive, diabolically abusive home. And he was put in a pediatric ward, and his growth levels were just zero, actually non-existent essentially. And he developed an emotional connection with one of the nurses, and within weeks his levels had rebounded to quote unquote normal levels. And then the nurse went away on vacation and they plummeted, and she came back 2 weeks later and they had rebounded again. So the correlation was fascinating, what they observed. Another example, he talks about the Romanian orphanage. So after the fall of communism there, thousands of babies were completely abandoned and neglected. And I remember reading, not in this book, but somewhere else, where a bottle of milk was thrown into a crib with 6 babies, and whichever baby got the milk survived, and the ones that didn't. And even the ones that survived, they didn't grow properly. They weren't stimulated, loved. Human contact was absolutely missing. So very sad, but these studies have shown that there is that direct correlation. And one really interesting story was, I don't know if you've heard the name of James Matthew Barrie, but if you haven't, you've definitely heard of Peter Pan. So that is its creator. So James Matthew Barrie created Peter Pan, along with many other stories and novellas and plays, and he was a phenomenal creator. But very sad life, and unconsummated marriage. Apparently his journals contained a lot of masochistic, kind of really sick and twisted things, writings and drawings and stuff, and he was very disturbed. And he was under 5 feet height, and according to Wikipedia it's 5'3", but I'm going to go with Sapolsky. He knows his stuff. He said under 5 feet. And he was saying that it was directly the cause of what he experienced growing up. He was completely there was no stimulation, no love, no a complete neglect emotionally. And he was well provided for otherwise, fed fine, everything was fine. But this is what contributed to his mental state, but also what contributed to his height. So the stunted growth. And when he was about 6, his older brother, I think, was 8, died in a terrible accident. He had older siblings as well, but they were the only 2 at home. And his father completely broke down, and his mother just spent all her time in bed and would confuse him for the child that had died. And then when he would say, "No, Mom, it's just me," she would say, "Oh, it's just you." And that was it. That was his experience at home from 6 and up. And he was shipped off to boarding school and just didn't experience any of that love or stimulation, anything from his parents. So In any event, that's a sad example that was given. Sad part of the book, but I thought it was just interesting to mention because of the correlation involved in the stress factors, um, and that's just like the emotional stress, right? The emotional and mental stress, as opposed to clothed, fed, everything else taken care of. But no, they're not growing, and this is why. Sapolsky talks about stress in different countries as well, and how different cultures respond to it, and how pervasive it is in some of the diseases, or just some of the ways that people deal with things. So, for instance, he talks about how in the Western world, Western culture, it's a struggle to get older. Men and women experience it differently, but apparently us women struggle a little bit more, and we find it very flattering and take it as a compliment if someone says to us, like, oh, like, you're 35, like, I thought you were 29. Whereas he talks about different African cultures, where if someone were to say to a 70-year-old, oh, I thought you were 50, like, you look great, that person would find that offensive, because it's an honor to get older in terms of the amount of respect paid toward that person. Knowledge is held higher, and wisdom than looks, for instance. So I mean, he didn't say that we're more superficial here in the West, but in terms of that, I mean, you could argue that. That was just one example. Also, he talks about stress in terms of like how Western women, he gave an example again, and how we would deal with stress. It's common for women to vent to a friend. In a more individualistic society, this is more common. Not in a less individualistic society, where the emphasis is more on the community, it's more common. He makes reference to some Asian cultures, where a woman will not vent to a friend, but will ask them more, like, oh, what's going on with you? Almost prompting them not to vent, but to share. And that's their way of dealing with stress in their lives. And he says it a lot better, but just to give you an idea, he does the whole like cultural thing, compares different cultures, talks about stress, and how stress is different in the West, and how it's very common for people in the West to attribute everything to stress. Every problem in their life or any ailment, then it's stress involved. And he's not saying that that's always wrong. A lot of illnesses and diseases also, like, stress plays a factor, whether it's like the chicken and egg thing. Is it the disease and then that causes stress, or is stress causing the disease? But he says that that's just like, we kind of overplay it a bit here, and I'll get to that in a minute. But he does say that stress is not universal, and it is not the cause of every illness. But he says, when it does cause an illness, when it is the cause, when stress is the cause, there are some rules. One, control. So control, but not trying to control the uncontrollable. So you have to be able to limit that. Like, you can only have so much control. And he talks about different factors too. Lots of studies. He cites lots of studies where, for instance, parents of a sick kid, they have a different reaction mentally, and they're more likely to not get sick themselves if they have the perspective of, we're going to be grateful for every day, and we're not going to worry about what tomorrow brings. Like, my child's in remission, I'm just going to focus like one day at a time. Versus parents, and he's not judging at all, and there's no judgment at all. It's just versus parents that say, okay, like, my kid's in remission, and like, that's it. Like, he will never get sick again. Like, remission means done, and that's the end of it. I don't want to talk about cancer anymore. He was just showing different examples of different studies that have proven that, if you have one mentality versus another, you're more likely to, rebound faster, not get sick. Another rule for when stress is the cause of the illness is to take things one day at a time. So take one thing, one step at a time. He says you need little pieces of taking on these massive challenges. He also talks about how predictive information is helpful, but only for things where it's useful to know about. There is no point in knowing about a possibility, an awful possibility that might not even happen. So yeah, limit the predictive information he finds in terms of helping you keep a positive mental outlook. He also says that outlets are important, of course, and sociality, so having a good support network. So those are some of the things he talks about when stress is the cause of the illness. There's just so much information in this book. It's too much to discuss. I really do recommend you picking up a copy, reading it, listening to it. He's excellent, excellent author. Great topic too. But just to conclude here, Sapolsky emphasizes that stress is not the cause of every disease or illness, but that in the world, and I quote, of middle class, harried, neurotic problems that we are all consumed with, have much to do with stress. So a lot of the things that we agonize over mentally have an awful lot to do with stress. And that, another quote, in our cognitively complex primate, westernized lifestyle of luxury, we're wallowing in psychogenic stressors. So, I mean, can't conclude any better than that. We have the potential, he says, to keep this stuff in perspective, though, and he wishes us all luck in dealing with our stressors. So, I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this interesting, and happy to know your thoughts and any questions, comments, and any books that you would like me to review. Let me know.